Imagine yourself stepping into a world where you're not the apex predator, where the sounds in the darkness beyond your fire could be something far larger, far more dangerous than anything alive today. Imagine walking through grasslands where the ground trembles beneath the weight of creatures taller than houses, where the night belongs to cats with teeth like daggers, where every hunt, every journey, every moment of survival depends on your ability to read a landscape ruled by giants. This is not fantasy. This is the world your ancestors knew. This is the Earth during the late Pleistocene, a time when humans were newcomers to continents already dominated by megafauna, animals so massive and powerful that they shaped entire ecosystems around them. For tens of thousands of years, our species shared this planet with woolly mammoths and saber-toothed cats, with ground sloths the size of elephants and bears larger than any alive today. We were small, we were vulnerable, and yet, somehow, we survived. Tonight we're going to walk into that world together. We'll stand in the shadow of the great mammoths, watch the saber-toothed hunters from a distance, and follow the footsteps of the first humans brave enough or desperate enough to carve out a life among creatures that could end them with a single strike. Before we begin, settle in. Let your breathing slow. There's no rush here, no urgency. The story we're exploring tonight unfolded over thousands of years, across vast continents, through cycles of cold and warmth that reshaped the entire planet. We're going to take our time, let the details unfold naturally, and allow ourselves to drift through a world that existed long before cities, before agriculture, before humans had any certainty that they would even survive. The world of the megafauna was not one place, it was many. If you had stood on the grasslands of North America 14,000 years ago, you would have seen herds of woolly mammoths moving across the horizon, their curved tusks catching the light, their thick fur rippling in the wind. These weren't solitary wanderers. They moved in family groups, mothers and calves staying close, older females leading the way to water sources and grazing grounds they had known for years. A full-grown mammoth could weigh 6 to 8 tons, stand nearly 4 meters tall at the shoulder, and live for 60 years or more. Their tusks, sometimes reaching lengths of 4 meters, weren't just for show. They used them to scrape snow away from vegetation, to fight off rivals, and perhaps to mark their path through the landscape. To watch them from a distance would have been mesmerizing. To encounter one up close would have been terrifying. But mammoths were only part of the picture. Alongside them roamed the mastodons, similar in size but different in habits, preferring forests and wetlands to open plains. Their teeth were adapted for browsing on leaves and branches rather than grazing on grass, and their tusks curved less dramatically than their mammoth cousins. In the same landscape, you might have seen herds of ancient bison, ancestors of the species that still survive today, and horses, not the domesticated animals we know, but wild creatures that had evolved in North America millions of years before, spreading to other continents. And then there were the predators. The short-faced bear, one of the largest carnivores to ever walk the earth, stood over 3 meters tall when rearing on its hind legs and could run faster than any bear alive today. It hunted across the open plains, powerful enough to bring down prey that other predators wouldn't dare approach. Dire wolves moved in packs, their jaws stronger than those of modern wolves, capable of crushing bone. And then there was Smilodon, the saber-toothed cat, perhaps the most iconic of all the Ice Age predators. Smilodon was not a tiger. It wasn't closely related to any cat alive today. It was something distinct, something that evolved its own way of hunting, its own way of surviving. About the size of a modern lion, but more powerfully built, with shorter legs and a stockier frame, Smilodon was designed for ambush. Its massive canine teeth, reaching up to 18 centimeters in length, were not for biting through bone. They were precision instruments, designed to slice through soft tissue, to sever arteries and windpipes with a single, calculated strike. To deliver that strike, Smilodon could open its jaws to an angle of over 110 degrees, far wider than any modern big cat. It would pin its prey with powerful forelimbs, then drive those saber teeth deep into the throat or belly, a killing technique so specialized that it had no room for error. A broken tooth meant starvation. A miscalculation meant injury. And yet, evidence from fossil sites suggests that injured Smilodon often survived long enough for their bones to heal, hinting that these cats may have lived in groups, may have shared food. With injured members, may have had social structures more complex than we once thought. If you crossed the ocean to South America, the giants would be different but no less impressive. Here, the ground sloths lumbered through forests and grasslands, some species growing as large as elephants. Megatherium, the giant ground sloth, could rear up on its hind legs to reach vegetation 6 meters above the ground. It had massive claws, powerful enough to pull down tree branches, and a body built like a living fortress. Unlike modern sloths that live in trees, these giants walked on the ground, slow but unstoppable, herbivores that shaped the vegetation around them simply by what they chose to eat. Their weight alone, sometimes reaching 4 tons, meant that every step left deep impressions in the soil, paths that smaller animals would follow, that rainwater would collect in, that would slowly reshape the landscape over centuries. Different species of ground sloths occupied different niches. Some preferred the forests, using their height to browse on leaves that no other animal could reach. Others grazed on the open grasslands, their broad muzzles perfect for cropping tough vegetation. Still others lived along coastlines, and there's evidence that some species may have been semi-aquatic, wading into shallow waters to feed on marsh plants. Alongside them lived the glyptodonts, armoured mammals that looked like enormous armadillos, some with tails ending in spiked clubs that could deliver bone-shattering blows to predators. These creatures carried shells made of hundreds of fused bone plates, armour so thick that few predators would have dared attack them. The largest species reached lengths of 3 meters and could weigh over a ton. They moved slowly, grazing peacefully, their armour making them nearly invulnerable to everything except perhaps the very largest predators or the cleverest hunters. South America also hosted its own unique predators, Smilodon populator, larger than its North American cousin, hunted the forests and grasslands. There were giant bears, enormous caimans in the rivers, and terror birds, though by the time humans arrived, these massive flightless predators were already declining, their reign ending even as a new age began. The mix of animals in South America was particularly diverse because of the Great American Interchange, the joining of North and South America roughly 3 million years ago when the Isthmus of Panama rose from the sea. Animals from both continents had mixed, creating an ecosystem unlike anywhere else on Earth. Ground sloths and glyptodonts, native to South America, shared the landscape with mammoths, saber-toothed cats, and other creatures that had migrated from the north. In Australia, the megafauna took on forms found nowhere else on Earth. The diprotodon, a marsupial the size of a rhinoceros, grazed across the continent. It looked somewhat like an enormous wombat, with powerful legs and a massive head. These creatures moved in herds, following water and vegetation across the vast interior of the continent. When they died, their bodies would have provided food for scavengers for weeks, their bones eventually sinking into the red earth or being preserved in dry lake beds where we find them today. Giant kangaroos, some species standing over 2 meters tall, hopped across the landscape in ways that modern kangaroos would recognize, but at a scale that seems almost impossible. These weren't the graceful jumpers we know today. They were massive, powerful creatures, some weighing 200 kilograms or more, with faces more suited to browsing on tough shrubs than grazing on grass. Enormous monitor lizards prowled the landscape, relatives of the Komodo dragon but even larger, some possibly reaching lengths of 6 or 7 meters. These were apex predators in their own right, ambush hunters that could bring down prey much larger than themselves, using the same tactics modern monitors employ: powerful jaws, serrated teeth, and possibly venomous saliva that would slowly weaken their victims. And massive flightless birds, the mihirung, stalked prey with beaks designed for tearing flesh, standing tall enough to look a human in the eye. The thylacoleo, sometimes called the marsupial lion, had the strongest bite force for its size of any mammal ever measured, capable of crushing bones that other predators could only gnaw. It wasn't truly a lion, wasn't even related to cats at all, but rather a marsupial predator that had evolved to fill the same ecological role. It had retractable claws, could climb trees, and may have hunted by dropping onto prey from above. using surprise and the power of its jaws to bring down animals far larger than itself. In Eurasia, the megafauna included woolly rhinoceroses, massive creatures covered in thick fur, with 2 horns and a body built like a living tank. They grazed the same steppes as the mammoths, occasionally competing for resources, occasionally falling prey to the same predators. Cave bears, larger than any modern bear, hibernated in the deep caves of Europe, leaving behind vast accumulations of bones that early humans sometimes used for their own purposes. Giant deer, sometimes called Irish elk, though they ranged across much of Eurasia, carried antlers that could span nearly 4 meters, the largest antlers of any deer that ever lived. These incredible structures weren't just for display, they were weapons, used in battles between males during mating season, clashing with such force that the sound would have echoed across the valleys. And there were the cave lions, larger than modern lions, hunting in the same territories where human groups were trying to establish themselves. These predators, along with cave hyenas and wolves, competed for the same prey, created a landscape where danger was constant, where humans had to be constantly aware of what else was moving through the shadows. Each continent had its own collection of giants, its own apex predators and mega-herbivores, its own ecosystem shaped by the presence of animals that weighed a ton or more. And into these worlds, already balanced, already functioning, already ancient, came humans. Small bipedal primates with no claws, no fangs, no armor, no natural weapons beyond the ability to think, to plan, and to work together. We weighed perhaps 50 or 60 kilograms. The largest animals around us weighed 50 or 100 times that much. We had no speed advantage, no strength advantage, no built-in weapons. What we had was fire, sharp stones, and each other. And somehow, that was enough. The first humans to encounter these giants did not arrive all at once. They came in waves spread over thousands of years, following game, seeking new territory, pushed by climate and curiosity across landscapes that had never known our species. In Australia, humans arrived perhaps as early as 65,000 years ago, though the exact timing remains debated. They found a continent filled with megafauna that had evolved in isolation for millions of years. Giant wombat-like creatures, massive flightless birds, predators that had never learned to fear a 2-legged hunter carrying a spear. The evidence of that first contact is scattered and fragmentary. Archaeological sites show human presence. Fossil sites show megafauna. But the moments where the two clearly intersect, where we can say with certainty that humans hunted or even encountered specific giant animals, are rare. In some cases, we find burned eggshells from enormous birds, suggesting that early Australians gathered and cooked eggs from species that would later vanish. In others, we find stone tools near megafaunal remains, though whether the humans hunted the animals or simply scavenged them after death is often impossible to determine. In Eurasia, the story is different because humans had been there longer. Neanderthals and early modern humans had shared the landscape with mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses for hundreds of thousands of years. The megafauna of Europe and Asia had evolved alongside human ancestors. They had learned, over countless generations, that these upright apes were dangerous, that they hunted in groups, that they used weapons and fire. When modern humans finally spread across these regions, they were not encountering naive prey. They were entering ecosystems where the balance between humans and megafauna had already been established, where both sides knew the rules. In the Americas, the arrival of humans marked one of the most significant ecological events in the hemisphere's history. The exact timing is still debated. Some evidence suggests humans reached North America 26,000 years ago, or even earlier. Other researchers argue for a later arrival, around 15,000 years ago, when melting glaciers opened corridors through the ice sheets that covered much of Canada. What is certain is that, once humans arrived, they spread rapidly. Within a few thousand years, human populations had reached the southern tip of South America, travelling through every type of habitat the continents had to offer. And everywhere they went, they encountered megafauna. Mammoths in the north, giant ground sloths in the forests, glyptodonts on the plains, saber-toothed cats and dire wolves following the same herds the humans depended on for survival. the landscape must have seemed impossibly rich, filled with game animals of every size from small deer to creatures weighing several tons. But it was also dangerous in ways that are difficult for us to imagine now. The largest predators alive today, lions and tigers and bears, are formidable, but they are smaller, less powerful than many of the Ice Age carnivores. A short-faced bear could stand eye to eye with a mammoth. A pack of dire wolves could bring down prey too large for any modern wolf to challenge. And Smilodon, with its specialized killing technique, was a threat even to animals that dwarfed it in size. For the first humans in these landscapes, survival meant learning to read the signs. The tracks in mud or snow that told you a mammoth herd had passed. The carcass picked clean by dire wolves that might still be nearby, watching from the tree line. The scent on the wind that warned of a saber-toothed cat hunting in the same valley. It meant knowing when to approach and when to retreat, when to hunt and when to hide, when to follow the herds and when to let them pass. It meant carrying knowledge that could mean the difference between eating and starving, between safety and death. Over time, humans developed strategies for living in this world of giants. They learned to hunt in ways that minimized risk and maximized reward. A solitary human with a spear was no match for a mammoth, but a coordinated group working together, using the landscape to their advantage, could bring down prey that would feed the entire band for weeks. Evidence from archaeological sites shows that humans hunted mammoths, though how frequently and how successfully remains a matter of debate. At Kraków-Spadzista in Poland, archaeologists have found the remains of over 100 mammoths, along with thousands of stone tools and clear signs of human activity. Stone spear points were found embedded in mammoth bones, showing direct evidence of hunting. The site dates to around 25,000 years ago, a time when Gravettian hunter-gatherers specialized in pursuing these enormous animals. But this kind of intensive mammoth hunting seems to have been the exception rather than the rule. At most sites, mammoth bones show no signs of human interaction. No cut marks, no embedded tools, no evidence of butchering. This has led some researchers to suggest that humans primarily scavenged mammoths that had died from natural causes, old age, illness, or getting trapped in bogs or tar pits. Others argue that the absence of evidence doesn't prove absence of hunting, that most kills would leave no trace, that stone tools striking bone would often shatter or bounce off without leaving marks that would survive tens of thousands of years. In Mexico, archaeologists discovered something extraordinary. 2 massive pits, each 25 meters in diameter and nearly 2 meters deep, filled with the bones of 14 woolly mammoths. The pits showed clear evidence of having been dug by humans, using wooden tools to excavate the frozen ground, creating traps designed to capture the enormous animals. Researchers believe that groups of 20 to 30 hunters would have used fire and noise to separate individual mammoths from the herd, driving them toward the hidden pits. Once trapped, the mammoths would have been dispatched with spears, and the entire community would have gathered to butcher the enormous carcasses. The site dates to nearly 15,000 years ago, showing that by this time some human groups had developed sophisticated communal hunting strategies that could reliably bring down the largest land animals on Earth. But not all interactions with megafauna involved hunting. Humans also found themselves competing with large predators for the same resources. If you killed a bison or a horse, you had to process it quickly before scavengers arrived. Dire wolves would have been drawn to the scent of blood. Saber-toothed cats might have been watching from a distance, waiting for an opportunity to claim your kill. Short-faced bears, with their size and power, could have simply walked up and taken what they wanted, leaving humans to retreat and hope there would be enough left when the bear moved on. There's also evidence that humans scavenged from predator kills. At sites across North America, researchers have found bones showing both carnivore tooth marks and cut marks from stone tools, suggesting that humans arrived after a predator had made the kill but before the carcass was completely consumed. This would have been risky work. Approaching a fresh kill meant potentially encountering the predator that made it. But for early humans living on the edge of survival, the risk may have been worth it. Beyond hunting and scavenging, megafauna provided resources that went far beyond meat. Mammoth bones were used to build shelters, particularly in treeless tundra environments where wood was scarce. Archaeological sites in Ukraine and Russia show huts constructed from mammoth skulls, ribs and leg bones, covered with hides and insulated with packed earth. These structures could house extended families through brutal winters. Mammoth ivory was carved into tools, ornaments, and eventually into art, some of the oldest known sculptures in the world. The thick fur from mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses could be used for clothing and bedding. Even the fat could be rendered for fuel, providing light and warmth in a world where every resource mattered. In this way, humans didn't just hunt the megafauna, they integrated them into every aspect of survival, learning to use every part of an animal, to waste nothing, to see these giants not just as threats or prey, but as providers of the raw materials needed to endure. Yet the relationship between humans and megafauna was never simple, never one-sided. Humans were not always the hunters. Sometimes they were the hunted. Saber-toothed cats, despite their specialized hunting techniques, were opportunistic enough to take prey that presented itself. There's no direct evidence of Smilodon hunting humans, but related saber-toothed species in Africa and Eurasia are known to have been man-eaters. It's entirely possible that early humans in the Americas occasionally fell prey to these cats, particularly children or individuals who strayed from the safety of the group. Short-faced bears, with their size and speed, would have been even more dangerous. Unlike modern bears, which often avoid confrontation with humans, the short-faced bear had no reason to fear a creature so much smaller than itself. If you encountered one, your best hope was that it had already eaten, that it wasn't interested in a confrontation, or that you could reach safety before it decided you were worth pursuing. Even herbivores posed threats. A mammoth defending its calf could trample a human without effort. A startled ground sloth, despite being a plant eater, had claws capable of disemboweling a predator foolish enough to get too close. Glyptodonts, slow and armoured, could swing their clubbed tails with enough force to shatter bones. Living among the megafauna meant living with constant awareness, with the knowledge that you were not invincible, that the world was full of things larger and stronger than you, and that survival depended on respect, caution, and the wisdom to know when to engage and when to simply stay out of the way. The evidence suggests that human populations during this time were small, scattered, moving, seasonally to follow game and plant resources. They lived in extended family groups, rarely numbering more than a few dozen individuals. In such small numbers, the impact of any single death would have been profound. Losing a skilled hunter or a knowledgeable elder could mean the difference between a group surviving the winter or disappearing entirely, and so humans adapted. They learned the patterns of the megafauna migrations, following herds across vast distances, setting up temporary camps near watering holes and river crossings where the animals would gather. They developed an intimate knowledge of animal behaviour, learning to read the signs that a mammoth herd was preparing to move, that a saber-toothed cat was stalking nearby, that dire wolves had made a kill in the next valley. This knowledge wasn't written down. It couldn't be. It was passed through stories, through observation, through the patient teaching of elders to younger generations. A child would learn which tracks belonged to which animals, how to tell if a print was fresh or days old, which plants the herbivores preferred, and which seasons brought them to particular feeding grounds. They would learn to read the depth of a track, the spacing between footfalls, whether an animal was walking calmly or running from danger. They would learn that mammoths left distinct patterns, the large round prints of their feet sometimes preserved in mud for days, telling stories about where the herd had been and where it might be going. They would learn the sounds of the night, how to distinguish the grunt of a mammoth from the roar of a short-faced bear, how to recognize the cough of a dire wolf pack coordinating an attack. Each sound had meaning, each carried information that could save your life or cost it. The low rumble of a mammoth herd moving at night meant staying close to camp, keeping the fire bright. The sharp crack of a saber-toothed cat's warning call meant freezing, becoming invisible, hoping that movement wouldn't draw attention. The howls of dire wolves communicating across distance meant that a hunt was underway somewhere nearby, and that approaching a fresh kill could bring you face to face with predators already feeding. They would learn fire, how to start it, how to maintain it, how to use it as both a tool and a barrier against the darkness where the predators moved. Fire knowledge was survival knowledge. You needed to know which materials burned hot and clean, which smouldered and produced smoke that could be used to preserve meat or keep insects at bay. You needed to know how to protect a flame in wind and rain, how to carry it from camp to camp, how to read the sky, and know when conditions were right for a fire to spread beyond control. Fire may have been one of humanity's greatest advantages in a world of megafauna. Most large animals fear it. The glow of flames at night would have kept predators at a distance, creating a circle of safety where humans could sleep, could tend their children, could repair their tools in relative peace. The dancing light would have reached out into the darkness, creating a boundary that few animals would cross. Within that circle, humans could rest, though even then, someone would need to stay awake, feeding the fire, watching for eyes reflecting in the darkness beyond its reach. Fire also allowed humans to drive game, to create controlled burns that would funnel animals toward waiting hunters, to modify the landscape in ways that made it more favourable for the prey species they depended on. By burning old vegetation, they encouraged new growth, tender shoots that would attract herbivores. By clearing underbrush, they created sight lines where they could see danger approaching. By managing fire across seasons, they shaped the land to support larger populations of the animals they hunted, creating a kind of proto-management that predated formal agriculture by thousands of years. But fire was also dangerous. In dry seasons, flames could race across the grasslands faster than a human could run. Managing fire meant understanding wind, humidity, the dryness of vegetation, the presence of natural fire breaks like rivers and rocky outcrops. It meant knowing when to light a fire and when to let the land rest. It meant reading the landscape with a sophistication that we're only beginning to appreciate. Beyond fire, humans relied on tools that grew more sophisticated with each generation. Stone tools weren't just sharp rocks. They were carefully designed instruments, each shape suited to a specific purpose. Long, slender points for spears that could penetrate deep into flesh. Broad, sharp-edged flakes for butchering, slicing through hide and muscle. Scrapers for cleaning hides, for removing fat and preparing skins for clothing. Each tool represented knowledge, the understanding of which stones flaked predictably, which shapes were most effective, which techniques produced the sharpest edges, making a good stone tool required skill, patience, and experience. You needed to understand the stone itself, how it would break, where the stress points were, how to strike it at just the right angle to produce the flake you wanted. Master toolmakers were valuable members of any group, their knowledge essential for survival. And tools wore out, broke, needed constant replacement. A successful mammoth hunt might dull or break dozens of stone points and cutting edges. Keeping a supply of good stone, knowing where quarries were located, planning routes that would take you past sources of flint or obsidian or chert, all of this was part of the complex web of knowledge required to survive. But even with fire, even with tools and cooperation and knowledge, humans remained vulnerable. The world belonged to the giants, and humans were merely finding ways to survive in it. They lived in small groups, extended families usually, moving with the seasons. In summer they might spread out small bands, hunting independently across territories rich with game and plant foods. In winter, they would gather in larger groups, pooling resources, sharing knowledge, enduring the cold months together in shelters built from mammoth bones and hides, heated by fires that burned day and night. These winter camps, the evidence suggests, were centres of social life. This was when tools were made and repaired, when knowledge was shared, when stories were told. The long dark nights would have been filled with voices, with the passing down of information that children needed to survive, which plants were poisonous and which could heal, where the herds would be in spring, how to read the weather, the stars, the behaviour of animals. This knowledge wasn't separate from survival. It was survival, accumulated over generations, refined through trial and error, preserved in memory and practice because writing didn't exist yet. Every person in the group carried knowledge that the group depended on. Lose, too, many people, and you lost knowledge that might never be recovered. This made every life precious, every death a potential catastrophe. When someone died, especially an elder who had survived for decades, who had seen things that no one else had seen, who knew things that no one else knew, the loss was profound. And in a world of megafauna, death was always close. disease, injury, predators, accidents all posed constant threats. A broken bone far from camp could mean slow death from exposure or predation. An infected wound with no antibiotics could kill even the strongest hunter. Childbirth was dangerous for mother and infant both. Living to old age, to 40 or 50 years, was an achievement, evidence of skill, luck, and the support of your community. The stress of this existence must have been immense, always watching, always alert, always aware that something larger and more dangerous might be nearby. Always weighing risks, calculating whether the potential reward of a hunt was worth the potential cost of injury or death. Always knowing that you depended on others and they depended on you, that survival was collective, that failing your group could mean failing everyone. Then, slowly, that world began to change. The timeline varies by continent, by region, even by specific valleys and plains, but across the globe, the megafauna started to disappear. In Australia, the first extinctions may have begun as early as 50,000 years ago. The giant flightless birds vanished. The enormous marsupials declined. By the time the Pleistocene ended and the Holocene began, around 11,700 years ago, most of Australia's megafauna were gone. In Eurasia, the losses were more gradual. Mammoths persisted in Siberia until 10,000 years ago. An isolated population survived even longer. On Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean, woolly mammoths lived until about 4,000 years ago, long after the pyramids were built in Egypt contemporary with early Bronze Age civilizations. But these were remnants, isolated populations clinging to existence in marginal habitats, while the rest of the world moved on without them. In the Americas, the extinctions were more sudden and more complete. Around 13,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, North America was home to over 50 species of megafauna. Within 3,000 years, 80% of them were gone. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, short-faced bears, ancient horses and camels all vanished from the continent. Only a few species survived, bison, muskoxen and caribou among them, animals that would continue to shape the landscape and human cultures for thousands of years to come. The question of what caused these extinctions has occupied scientists for decades, and the answer is almost certainly complex, a combination of factors rather than a single cause. Climate change played a role. As the last ice age ended, temperatures rose. The vast grasslands that supported mammoth herds shrank, replaced by forests and wetlands. The mammoth steppe, that enormous expanse of cold, dry grassland that stretched across much of the northern hemisphere, fragmented and eventually disappeared, taking with it the habitat that megafaunal herbivores depended on. But the relationship between climate and extinction wasn't simple or uniform. Different regions experienced different patterns. In Europe, where humans and megafauna had coexisted for hundreds of thousands of years, the extinctions were gradual, spread over tens of thousands of years. Mammoths retreated northward as forests advanced, finding refuge in Siberia, where the steppe habitat persisted longest. Woolly rhinoceroses followed similar patterns, their ranges shrinking until only remnant populations remained in the coldest, most marginal habitats. In North America, the timing was different. The extinctions there were concentrated in a relatively narrow window between 13 and 10,000 years ago, coinciding not just with rapid climate change but also with the spread of human populations across the continent. The Clovis culture, named for distinctive stone points first found in New Mexico, appeared around 13,000 years ago and spread rapidly across North America. Whether this represents the first human arrival or simply a new cultural development among populations that had been there longer is still debated. But the timing of Clovis and the timing of extinctions overlap in ways that some researchers find compelling. But climate change alone doesn't explain the pattern. The Earth had been through similar warming periods before, glacial cycles that came and went over hundreds of thousands of years, and the megafauna had survived them. Interglacial periods, warm intervals between ice ages, had occurred many times in the Pleistocene. Yet the megafauna persisted through all of them, adapting to changing conditions, shifting their ranges, finding new habitats. What was different about this particular warming period at the end of the Pleistocene? The most obvious difference was the presence of humans. Not just present, but spreading, increasing in numbers, developing new technologies, becoming more effective hunters. The debate centres on whether humans were the primary cause of megafaunal extinction, or whether they simply added additional pressure to populations already stressed by climate change. Some researchers point to the overkill hypothesis, the idea that human hunting drove megafauna to extinction, particularly in regions where the animals had never encountered human hunters before. In this view, megafauna in the Americas and Australia were naive, unafraid of humans because they had no evolutionary history with them, no learned behaviours that would have taught them to flee or defend themselves. Think about it from the animal's perspective. For millions of years, their ancestors had evolved in landscapes where the largest predators were other megafauna. Saber-toothed cats, dire wolves. These were familiar threats, dangers that could be recognised, defended against, avoided through behaviour that had been refined over countless generations. But humans were something new. Small, slow, seemingly harmless creatures that approached in groups, that used strange techniques, that attacked from distance with thrown weapons. By the time megafauna learned to fear humans, to recognise them as threats, it may have been too late. Human hunters, arriving with sophisticated weapons and cooperative hunting strategies, could have quickly decimated populations before the animals had time to adapt. Evidence for this includes the timing. In many regions, megafaunal extinctions closely coincide with the first appearance of humans. In Australia, the extinctions begin not long after human arrival. In the Americas, the extinctions accelerate after the first well-documented human presence. The correlation is strong enough that some researchers consider it compelling. In New Zealand, which humans only reached around 700 years ago, the timing is even more dramatic. Within a few centuries of human arrival, the islands lost all of their large flightless birds. The moa, some species standing over 3 meters tall. Here, the connection between human hunting and extinction seems undeniable. The moa had evolved in isolation, with no mammalian predators at all. When humans arrived with dogs and fire and hunting techniques refined over thousands of years on other continents, the birds had no defences, no behaviours that could protect them. But others argue that correlation doesn't prove causation. They point out that direct evidence of human hunting is relatively rare. Sites showing clear signs of mammoth hunting, like Krakow's Spadzista or the Mexican mammoth traps, are exceptional rather than common. For many megafaunal species, there's no archaeological evidence of human hunting at all. No kill sites, no butchered bones, no cave paintings depicting the hunt. The absence of evidence is particularly striking for some of the largest herbivores. Horses and camels were abundant in the fossil record of North America, yet there's almost no archaeological evidence that humans hunted them. Does this mean they didn't? Or does it simply mean that the evidence hasn't survived or hasn't been found? Preservation bias is a real problem in archaeology. Most kills would leave no trace. Soft tissue decays, bones scatter. The specific combinations of conditions required to preserve evidence, burial in the right kind of sediment, protection from scavengers, discovery by researchers thousands of years later are rare. We may be seeing only a tiny fraction of what actually occurred. A more nuanced view suggests that humans and climate change work together, a synergy of pressures that prove too much for the megafauna to withstand. In this scenario, climate change stressed populations by reducing habitat and food resources. Birth rates may have declined, survival rates for young animals may have dropped. Megafauna generally have slow reproduction rates. Mammoths, like modern elephants, had long gestation periods and raised relatively few young. A female mammoth might give birth only once every 5 or 6 years. If calf mortality increased even slightly, populations could begin to decline. And into this already vulnerable situation came human hunters, taking animals that populations could no longer afford to lose. Even relatively light hunting pressure, sustainable under normal conditions, could have tipped stressed populations into terminal decline. If you're taking 10% of a healthy growing population, it can absorb that loss. If you're taking 10% of a population that's already shrinking due to climate stress, that might be enough to push them past the point of recovery. There's also evidence that humans altered landscapes in, ways that affected megafauna beyond direct hunting. The use of fire, for example, changed vegetation patterns in profound ways. Controlled burns, used to flush game or promote the growth of certain plant species, would have reduced woody vegetation and altered the mix of plants available for herbivores. For some species, this may have made the landscape more favourable. For others, particularly browsers that depended on trees and shrubs, it may have reduced critical food sources. In Australia, there's evidence of significant vegetation change coinciding with human arrival and the use of fire. Forests thinned, grasslands expanded. For some megafauna, this might have been beneficial. For others, it was catastrophic. The giant browsers, animals that fed on tree leaves and shrubs, would have found their food sources diminishing even as the climate changed. The compounding pressures, habitat loss from climate, habitat modification from human fire use and direct hunting may have created a perfect storm of extinction. Recent studies have also revealed something surprising. In some regions, megafauna survived much longer than previously thought. In Brazil, remains of giant ground sloths and other megafauna have been dated to as recently as 3,500 years ago, thousands of years after they supposedly went extinct. This suggests that in some refugia, in isolated pockets of suitable habitat, megafauna may have persisted long after they vanished from most of their former range. If this is true, it complicates the extinction narrative. Instead of a single, rapid die-off, the disappearance of megafauna may have been a drawn-out process, different in every region, influenced by local conditions and the particular history of human-animal interactions. What we do know is that by the time the Holocene was well underway, by the time the great ice sheets had retreated and forests had reclaimed much of the northern hemisphere, the world of the giants was over. The megafauna that remained, elephants in Africa and Asia, bison in North America, kangaroos in Australia were survivors, remnants of a far richer fauna that had once dominated every continent. When the megafauna disappeared, they took more than just themselves. They took entire ways of life, ecological relationships that had persisted for millions of years. Megafaunal herbivores were ecosystem engineers, animals that shaped their environment so profoundly that their presence affected every other species around them. Mammoths, for instance, didn't just eat grass. They knocked down trees, creating and maintaining the open grasslands that other species depended on. When mammoths browsed in forests, they thinned the undergrowth, creating diverse habitat mosaics. Their movements trampled vegetation, creating paths that smaller animals used. Their dung fertilized the soil and spread seeds across vast distances. When they died, their enormous carcasses fed scavengers for months, supporting populations of ravens, vultures, foxes, and countless insects. Without mammoths, forests expanded, grasslands shrank. The open, park-like landscapes that had characterized much of the northern hemisphere gave way to denser, darker forests. Fire regimes changed. Without large herbivores to graze down the vegetation, fuel built up, and wildfires may have become more intense. The loss of megafauna may have even affected the atmosphere. Recent studies suggest that the extinction of megafaunal herbivores caused a measurable reduction in atmospheric methane. These animals produced enormous amounts of methane through their digestive processes. When they vanished, so did that source of greenhouse gas. One study estimated that the extinction of megafauna in the Americas alone may have reduced methane production by nearly 10 million tons per year. It's a strange reversal. The loss of these animals may have contributed to a cooling climate, reinforcing the very changes that helped drive them to extinction in the first place. For the predators, the extinctions were equally catastrophic. Saber-toothed cats, specialized for hunting large, thick-skinned prey, found themselves in a world with fewer and fewer suitable targets. As mammoths and ground sloths disappeared, Smilodon had to adapt or starve. Evidence from the very end of the Pleistocene shows signs of stress in predator populations. Broken teeth become more common, suggesting increased competition for food, desperation feeding on bones and carcasses, fights over dwindling resources. Within a few thousand years of the megafaunal herbivores vanishing, the large predators followed. Smilodon disappeared from the fossil record around 10,000 years ago. Dire wolves, short-faced bears, all the great carnivores of the Ice Age vanished in what amounts to a geological instant. What survived were the smaller, more adaptable species. Wolves that could hunt deer instead of bison, cats that could take rabbits instead of mammoths, bears that could eat fish and berries as readily as meat. The world was reshaped, not just in what lived in it, but in how those living things related to each other. And for humans, the disappearance of the megafauna marked the end of an era. For tens of thousands of years, human survival had been intimately tied to following the herds, to hunting the large animals that provided so much meat, so many resources from a single kill. When the giants disappeared, humans had to adapt. Diets broadened. Instead of relying on a few large prey species, human groups began exploiting a wider range of animals and plants. Fishing became more important. Small game, once ignored in favour of larger targets, became dietary staples. In many regions, this diversification of the diet coincided with the development of new technologies. Bows and arrows, better suited for hunting smaller, faster prey. Nets and traps for catching birds and fish. Groundstone tools for processing plant foods. Some researchers argue that the loss of megafauna may have been one of the pressures that eventually led to agriculture. When you can no longer depend on following mammoth herds, when the easy calories from large prey are gone, the incentive to cultivate plants and manage smaller animal populations increases. The world became, in some ways, smaller, more labour-intensive, requiring constant attention to a wider array of resources rather than focused pursuit of a few large ones. But something else was lost too, something harder to quantify: the psychological impact of living in a world of giants. When you've spent your entire life in a landscape where mammoths shake the ground, where the roar of a short-faced bear echoes across the plains, where the night belongs to predators with fangs like knives, the disappearance of those creatures must have seemed apocalyptic. There's a reason that megafauna dominate the oldest human art. The cave paintings of Lascaux, Altamira, Chauvet show mammoths, bison, horses, cave lions. These animals weren't just food. They were central to the human experience, to the mythology, the spirituality, the very identity of the people who painted them. To lose them would have been like losing the gods. Some researchers have suggested that the memory of megafauna persisted in human cultures long after the animals themselves were gone, showing up in myths and legends of giants, of dragons, of enormous beasts that once walked the earth. It's impossible to prove, but it's a haunting thought, that somewhere in our oldest stories, buried beneath thousands of years of retelling, might be echoes of the time when humans walked among creatures that dwarfed them, when the world was wilder and stranger and more dangerous than anything we know today. What we're left with are fragments, bones in museums, footprints preserved in ancient mud, the DNA of animals that have been extinct for thousands of years, and in a few places the descendants of that vanished world. Bison still roam, though in numbers far smaller than the herds that once darkened the plains. Musk oxen survive in the Arctic, virtually unchanged from their Ice Age ancestors. Elephants in Africa and Asia are the last of the proboscideans, a lineage that once included dozens of species across every continent except Antarctica and Australia. These survivors are living links to a world we've lost, reminders that the age of megafauna isn't some distant, unimaginable past. It's recent enough that we can still see its traces, still touch the bones, still walk the landscapes carved by the passage of giants. And if we look closely, we can see ourselves in that story too. We are shaped by the time when we were small, when survival meant reading the landscape for signs of danger, when cooperation was the only way to bring down prey too large for any individual to handle. The skills that humans developed in that world, planning, communication, tool-making, social organisation, became the foundations of everything that followed. We learned to think ahead, to imagine scenarios, to plan for contingencies. A mammoth hunt couldn't be improvised. It required coordination, forethought, the ability to communicate complex ideas, and trust that everyone would play their part. Those abilities, honed over thousands of generations in the shadow of megafauna, are what eventually allowed humans to build civilizations, to develop agriculture, to spread across every environment on Earth. In a very real sense, the world of the giants made us who we are. We carry it with us, not just in our history, but in our neurology, our social structures, the ways we relate to each other, and to the animals that remain. When we work together to solve problems, when we tell stories around a fire, when we feel a thrill of fear and awe at the sight of a large wild animal, we're echoing behaviours that kept our ancestors alive in a far more dangerous world. The giants are gone, but their influence remains, written into our DNA, into our cultures, into the very landscapes we inhabit. And perhaps that's the most important lesson from this ancient time, that the world is always changing, that what seems permanent can vanish, that survival depends on adaptation, on the ability to learn and change and find new ways forward when the old ways no longer work. The megafauna taught us that, not intentionally, not as mentors or guides, but simply by existing, by being the dominant force in the landscape, by requiring that humans become clever, adaptable, and cooperative in order to survive. And when they were gone, those lessons remained, woven into the fabric of human culture and consciousness in ways we're still discovering. Consider what it meant to live in that world on a daily basis. Every morning, you would wake to uncertainty. The fire from the night before might have died, leaving you vulnerable. The sounds outside your shelter, whether it was a cave, a hide tent, or a structure built from mammoth bones, would tell you what kind of day lay ahead. Silence might mean safety, or it might mean that predators were near, hunting quietly. The calls of birds could signal that all was well, or that something had disturbed them. You would emerge into a landscape that required constant vigilance, where every ridge, every stand of trees, every water source was a place that needed to be assessed for danger before you approached. The megafauna weren't just background scenery. They were active participants in your existence, shaping your choices, your movements, your very survival strategies moment by moment. Each species of megafauna presented its own unique challenges and opportunities. The woolly mammoth, for all its size, was actually a relatively docile herbivore when left undisturbed. They moved in matriarchal herds, led by experienced females who remembered water sources and safe routes across the landscape. These herds followed predictable patterns, migrating with the seasons, returning to favoured feeding grounds year after year. For humans who learned these patterns, mammoths became a reliable resource, animals that could be anticipated, tracked, and occasionally hunted when conditions were right. The key was understanding mammoth behaviour, knowing when the herd would be vulnerable, when calves were being born, when males competed during mating season and became aggressive and dangerous. A human group that understood mammoths intimately could position themselves along migration routes, could predict where the herd would be weeks or even months in advance, could plan hunts around the rhythms of mammoth life. But this required knowledge accumulated over generations, observations passed down from grandparents who had spent their entire lives following the herds, learning to read the subtle signs of mammoth behaviour, understanding the complex social dynamics within the herd. Mammoths weren't just prey, they were living encyclopedias of environmental knowledge, their presence indicating where water could be found, where the best vegetation grew, which routes through the landscape were safest. By watching mammoths, humans could learn about their environment, using the giants as guides through a world that was constantly changing. The woolly rhinoceros presented different challenges. More solitary than mammoths, these massive creatures were temperamental and potentially aggressive. Their poor eyesight meant they might charge at perceived threats without provocation. Their thick, shaggy coats and robust build made them formidable opponents, nearly impervious to anything but the most precisely placed spear thrust. Yet they too followed predictable patterns, visiting salt licks, wallowing in specific mud holes, taking regular routes between feeding and watering areas. Humans who learned these patterns could avoid rhinoceros encounters when they wanted to, or could set ambushes when a successful hunt was worth the considerable risk. The cave bears of Europe represented yet another type of relationship. These enormous bears, standing over 3 meters tall when reared up, were primarily herbivorous despite their size and fearsome appearance. They spent much of their time in caves, which early humans also used for shelter. This created a complex territorial situation. Some caves show evidence of both bear and human occupation, though usually at different times, the bears using the deep recesses for hibernation, while humans occupied the entrance areas. Learning to read the signs of bear presence, understanding when hibernation began and ended, knowing which caves were safe to enter and which were occupied. All of this was essential knowledge for survival. Cave bear remains in human archaeological sites suggest that these giants were occasionally hunted or scavenged. Their massive bones providing material for tools and construction, their fat and meat providing crucial calories, but they were also dangerous, particularly when disturbed during hibernation or when defending cubs. The balance between utilizing cave bears as a resource and avoiding deadly confrontations required sophisticated understanding of bear behavior and careful planning. In North America, the short-faced bear represented an even greater threat. Unlike cave bears or modern bears, the short-faced bear was a hypercarnivore, a specialized meat-eater with long legs built for running. It was one of the fastest bears to ever live, capable of chasing down prey across open plains. For early humans, the short-faced bear was less a potential resource and more a competitor and threat, an apex predator that could dominate any carcass, that might see humans themselves as prey. Avoiding these bears would have been a priority, and any encounter would have been potentially fatal. The evidence suggests that human presence in some areas of North America may have been limited by short-faced bear populations with humans only, able to establish themselves in certain regions after these bears began to decline. The dire wolf, hunting in packs, added another layer of complexity to the Pleistocene landscape. Larger and more powerful than modern wolves, with jaws capable of crushing bone, dire wolves were formidable predators. But they were also social animals with complex behaviors. A pack of dire wolves operating cooperatively could bring down prey much larger than any individual wolf could handle. For humans, this meant both competition and opportunity. Dire wolf packs might drive humans away from kills, or humans might scavenge from dire wolf kills, or the two species might occasionally cooperate, following the same herds, each benefiting from the other's hunting efforts. The relationship between humans and dire wolves may have been complex and variable, sometimes competitive, sometimes tolerant, depending on local conditions and the abundance of prey. The giant ground sloths of the Americas represent one of the most intriguing members of the megafaunal community. These creatures, some species reaching the size of elephants, were unlike anything alive today. Moving slowly, using their enormous claws to pull down branches and excavate burrows, ground sloths seem at first glance to have been easy prey, but their size, their powerful claws capable of disemboweling a predator, and their thick skin made them dangerous to approach. Evidence from South America suggests that humans did hunt ground sloths, but the hunts would have required careful planning and multiple hunters working together. The reward, however, was substantial. A single giant ground sloth could provide as much meat as several horses or bison, enough to feed a large group for weeks. And unlike herd animals that might flee at the first sign of danger, ground sloths were relatively sedentary, often returning to the same areas to feed, making them predictable targets for patient hunters. The glyptodonts, those armoured mammals that looked like enormous armadillos, presented their own unique challenges. Hunting a glyptodont would have been nearly impossible under normal circumstances. Their armour was too thick to penetrate, their bodies too low to the ground to target vulnerable areas. But glyptodonts had weaknesses. They moved slowly and had poor manoeuvrability. A coordinated group of hunters might have been able to flip one onto its back, exposing the softer underside. Or they might have driven glyptodonts into bogs or pit traps where the animal's weight and inability to climb out would make them vulnerable. The shells themselves were valuable, potentially used as shelters or storage containers, making the considerable effort of hunting these armoured giants worthwhile. In Australia, the megafauna presented unique challenges because they included not just large herbivores, but also massive predators and strange creatures found nowhere else. The thylacoleo, the marsupial lion, was an ambush predator that may have hunted from trees, dropping onto prey from above. For humans moving through forested areas, the threat could come from any direction, requiring constant vigilance not just at ground level, but also in the canopy above. The giant monitor lizards, reaching lengths that rivaled crocodiles, were another uniquely Australian threat. These massive reptiles, like their smaller modern relatives, were intelligent, patient hunters. They could track prey for days, waiting for an opportunity to strike. Unlike mammalian predators, they didn't need to feed frequently, could go weeks or months between meals. This patience made them unpredictable, potentially waiting in ambush near water sources or along frequently used trails. For early Australians, learning the behaviour of these giant monitors, understanding their preferred ambush sites, recognising the signs of their presence would have been crucial for survival. If you needed water, you couldn't simply walk to the nearest stream, you had to consider who else might be using that water source. A mammoth herd gathering to drink would make the area impassable, dangerous to approach. Predators knew that prey gathered at water, and they would position themselves accordingly. You might have to wait, watching from a distance, timing your approach for when the giants had moved on but before the next wave of visitors arrived. And this wasn't just about one water source. It was about understanding the entire network of resources in your territory, knowing which springs were safer, which rivers had shallow crossings, which lakes attracted which animals at which times of year. If you were hunting, the presence of megafauna complicated everything. You might track a herd of horses for days, waiting for the right moment to strike, only to have a short-faced bear appear and scatter the entire herd. You might successfully bring down prey, only to find yourself in a race against time to process the meat before scavengers arrived. Every kill site became a potential flashpoint, a place where multiple species might converge, each with their own interests, their own claims to the carcass. Humans weren't the only ones who understood the value of a fresh kill, and in those confrontations, humans were rarely the most powerful party at the table. The evidence suggests that early humans developed elaborate strategies for managing these situations. At some kill sites, archaeologists have found evidence of rapid butchering, carcasses processed with incredible speed, presumably to remove as much usable meat as possible before larger predators arrived. In other cases, there's evidence of more leisurely processing, suggesting that the location was defensible, that fires were maintained to keep scavengers at bay, that the human group felt secure enough to take their time. The seasonal movements of megafauna would have dictated human movements as well. Mammoths migrated following the growth of vegetation as the seasons changed. In summer, they might move north or to higher elevations, seeking fresh grass and escaping the worst of the insects. In winter, they would move to lower elevations, to areas where wind kept the snow shallow enough to feed through. Human groups that depended on mammoths would have to follow these patterns, or at least anticipate them, positioning themselves along migration routes, near calving grounds, in places where the mammoths would reliably appear. But following the herds wasn't simple. It meant travelling long distances across landscapes that held their own dangers. River crossings where you might encounter hippo-like creatures, or enormous crocodilians. Mountain passes where cave bears denned. Open plains where you were visible to predators for kilometres. Every journey was a calculated risk, weighing the need for food against the dangers of the route. And you couldn't just follow blindly. You had to stay close enough to the herds to benefit from them, but not so close that you became a target for the predators that also followed them. There's evidence from multiple sites that suggests humans and predators sometimes use the same hunting grounds, the same overlooks, the same ambush points. At some locations in Europe, researchers have found layers of sediment containing both human artifacts and the remains of cave lions, dire wolves, and hyenas, all using the same strategic locations to hunt the same prey species. The landscape wasn't divided neatly into human territory and predator territory. It was shared space, contested space, where multiple intelligent hunters competed for the same resources, and sometimes, inevitably, came into direct conflict. We know from the fossil record that this conflict was real. Human bones bearing the tooth marks of the large carnivores have been found at sites across Eurasia and Africa. These weren't always scavenging marks, weren't always predators feeding on humans who had already died from other causes. Some show the patterns consistent with predation, with humans killed and partially consumed by large carnivores. Children would have been particularly vulnerable, moving more slowly than the adults, less aware of dangers, more prone to wandering from the safety of the group. The fear of losing children to predators must have been constant, shaping parenting behaviours, group dynamics, settlement patterns. This is something we've largely forgotten in the modern world, this sense of being prey. Most of us live our entire lives without ever experiencing what it's like to be hunted by something that sees us as food. But for our ancestors living among the megafauna, that awareness was always present. It shaped how they moved, where they slept, how they raised their children. It created a psychology of vigilance, of threat assessment, of constant environmental scanning that we still carry traces of today. That feeling you get when you walk through a dark forest and your mind starts imagining threats, when you hear a sound you can't identify and feel your heart rate increase, when you instinctively assess your surroundings upon entering a new space. All of these are inheritances from a time when such vigilance was the difference between living and dying. The megafauna also shaped human social bonds in profound ways. In a world where large predators prowled and enormous herbivores could accidentally crush you, staying alone meant almost certain death. Cooperation wasn't just advantageous, it was essential. This created pressures for humans to develop more sophisticated social structures, better communication, stronger bonds between group members. We had to learn to coordinate our actions, to share information efficiently, to trust each other implicitly during hunts where mistakes could be fatal. The complexity of hunting large, dangerous prey may have driven the development of more complex language. You couldn't just grunt and point when planning how to drive a mammoth toward a trap. You needed to convey timing, positioning, contingency plans. You needed to describe terrain that the other hunters couldn't see, to explain what you wanted them to do under various scenarios, to coordinate actions across distances. This pressure for communication, for the ability to convey complex information quickly and accurately, may have been one of the forces pushing human language to become more sophisticated, more nuanced, more capable of expressing abstract thoughts and detailed plans. Social bonds were also reinforced through the distribution of resources from successful hunts. A mammoth provided more meat than any single family could consume before it spoiled. Sharing wasn't just generous, it was practical, and it created obligations, networks of reciprocity that bound groups together. If you shared your successful hunt today, you could expect others to share with you when their hunts were successful. This created a social safety net, a way of buffering against the inevitable failures that every hunter experienced. No one succeeded every time, but in a group where success was shared, everyone benefited from the collective success rate. These sharing networks extended beyond just food. Knowledge was shared, techniques for making better tools, information about where herds were moving, warnings about predator activity in certain areas. Stories were shared, accounts of successful hunts and near disasters, tales that encoded important survival information while also strengthening group identity and cohesion. The long nights around the fire weren't just social time. They were the primary mechanism for cultural transmission, for passing down the accumulated wisdom of generations. And in a world where the megafauna could change everything in an instant, where a mammoth migration could mean abundance or starvation, where a saber-toothed cat in the wrong place could mean death, that cultural knowledge was survival itself. The material culture of these early humans, the tools and ornaments we find in archaeological sites, also reflects the world of megafauna. Beads and pendants were often made from mammoth ivory, materials that were both beautiful and precious, requiring skill to work and representing successful hunts or fortunate scavenging. Wearing ivory ornaments wasn't just decoration. It was a statement about your success, your skill, your status within the group. The most skilled hunters, those who could successfully bring down dangerous prey or who knew the best scavenging locations, would have had access to the best materials, and in small groups where everyone knew everyone, where survival depended on cooperation but also on having skilled members, these markers of competence mattered. They helped establish hierarchies, determined who made decisions, influenced who mated with whom. The weapons themselves evolved in response to megafaunal prey. The earlier stone points were relatively simple, basic flakes with sharp edges, but over time, as humans specialized in hunting larger, more dangerous animals, the points became more sophisticated. The Clovis points of North America, for instance, are masterworks of stone knapping, carefully designed to penetrate deeply, to create maximum tissue damage, to remain embedded in the wound even as the animal fled. Making such a point required hours of careful work, deep understanding of stone mechanics, and considerable skill. These weren't casual tools. They were precision instruments, created specifically for the task of bringing down the largest and most dangerous prey on Earth. But the relationship with megafauna wasn't purely adversarial or utilitarian. There's evidence that early humans held these animals in something approaching reverence. The cave art we find across Europe shows this clearly. Mammoths, bison, horses, cave lions, these animals are depicted with care, with attention to detail, often with what seems like respect or even affection. The artist who painted these images, working by flickering firelight deep in caves, weren't just recording what they'd seen. They were creating something meaningful, something that mattered to their communities. Some researchers believe these paintings had spiritual significance, that they were part of hunting magic, rituals designed to ensure successful hunts or to honour the animals that gave their lives. Others suggest they were teaching tools, ways of passing down knowledge about animal behaviour and anatomy. Still others think they might have been art for art's sake, expressions of the same creative impulse that drives humans to make art today. Whatever their purpose, these paintings show that megafauna occupied a central place in the human imagination. They weren't just seen as resources or threats. They were seen as worthy of representation, of commemoration, of the considerable effort required to paint them on cave walls that would last for tens of thousands of years. In some cases, we find evidence of even more, direct interaction between humans and megafauna, interactions that blur the line between hunting and something else. There are sites where mammoth bones have been arranged in ways that seem deliberate, patterns that suggest meaning beyond simple disposal of remains, skulls placed in circles, tusks positioned in parallel lines, arrangements that took effort, that served no obvious practical purpose. Were these monuments, memorials, territorial markers? We may never know, but they suggest that humans saw megafauna as more than just meat and materials. They saw them as important in ways that we're still trying to understand. The disappearance of these animals would have affected humans not just materially but psychologically and spiritually. Imagine watching the herds grow smaller year by year, noticing that the mammoths you saw as a child are rarely seen by the time you have grandchildren, recognizing that the landscape is changing, that the great animals that defined your world are fading away. For people who had no concept of extinction, who had no framework for understanding that a species could simply cease to exist, this must have been deeply unsettling. Did they notice? Did they understand what was happening? We have no direct evidence, no written records from that time. But it's hard to imagine that such a fundamental change in the world could go unnoticed, especially by people whose survival depended on intimate knowledge of their environment. They must have seen it, must have talked about it, must have wondered why the giants were leaving. Some researchers have speculated that this experience, watching the megafauna disappear, might have given rise to some of humanity's earliest myths about a lost golden age. Stories of a time when the world was richer, stranger, more full of wonders than the present. Every culture has stories like this, tales of giants and monsters, of a time when the earth was different. Could some of these be distant echoes of actual memories passed down through so many generations that the truth became myth? The evidence from those final millennia, the period when the megafauna were disappearing, shows changes in human behaviour as well. Diets diversified. The archaeological record shows increased use of fish, birds, small mammals, plant materials. Toolkits became more varied, including specialised implements for processing these new resources. Some groups began to settle in richer areas, rather than following migratory herds, establishing semi-permanent camps near productive rivers or coastlines. These changes represent adaptations to a world with fewer large prey animals, strategies for survival when the megafauna could no longer be relied upon. But they also represent innovations that would eventually lead to agriculture, to sedentism, to the development of civilizations. The loss of megafauna, as catastrophic as it was, created pressures that pushed humans toward new ways of living, new strategies that would eventually reshape the world even more profoundly than the megafauna had. In some regions, the transition seems to have been relatively smooth. In others, there's evidence of population decline, of sites being abandoned, of hard times. The carrying capacity of the land changed when the megafauna disappeared. Areas that could support large human populations when mammoth hunting was productive might support far fewer people when hunting was limited to smaller game. Some groups may have thrived by quickly adapting to new resources. Others may have struggled, declined, or disappeared entirely. And through all of this, there would have been the memories. The old people who remembered when mammoths were common, when saber-toothed cats still prowled, when the night was filled with sounds that had since fallen silent? What did they tell the young people who had never seen these things, who lived in a diminished world and didn't even know it? How do you explain what has been lost when the loss is so total that nothing remains but memory? The archaeological record from this transition period also shows something else: the beginnings of domestication. Dogs appear in the archaeological record around 15,000 years ago, the first animals to enter into partnership with humans. These early dogs weren't pets in the modern sense. They were working animals helping with hunts, providing warning of approaching predators, consuming waste and thereby reducing scavengers around human camps. But they were also companions, social animals that bonded with humans, that lived alongside us in ways that wild animals did not. The domestication of dogs may have been partly a response to the disappearance of megafauna. With fewer large prey animals to hunt, humans may have had more time and resources to invest in relationships with other species. Or perhaps dogs filled a psychological void left by the vanishing giants, providing a connection to the wild world that was otherwise becoming more distant. Whatever the reason, the partnership between humans and dogs, the first of many domestications that would follow, began in the shadow of the ending megafaunal age. Within a few thousand years of the major extinctions, humans had also begun to domesticate plants, selecting and cultivating species that provided reliable food sources. Wheat and barley in the Middle East, rice in Asia, maize in the Americas. This wasn't a sudden revolution. It was a gradual process, developing over thousands of years as humans experimented with managing plant and animal populations. But it represented a fundamental shift in how humans related to their environment, from following and hunting the wild herds to creating managed landscapes where the resources humans needed were deliberately cultivated and controlled. In a sense, the disappearance of the megafauna forced humans to take control of their food supply in new ways. When you couldn't rely on mammoth herds, you had to find other strategies. Agriculture was one answer. Domestication of smaller animals, sheep, goats, pigs, cattle was another. These strategies would eventually prove successful beyond anything the megafauna hunters could have imagined, supporting vastly larger human populations and enabling the development of complex civilizations. But they also represented a loss, a severing of the ancient relationship between humans and the great wild animals that had shaped our evolution. As humans transitioned to agriculture and settled life, the direct experience of living among megafauna faded from immediate memory into legend. But the psychological legacy remained. The fear of large predators, even when those predators no longer existed. The thrill of encountering large wild animals, a mix of awe and fear that we still feel when we see elephants or bears or big cats. The tendency to organize into cooperative groups, to share resources, to communicate complex information. All of these traits that had been honed in the world of megafauna continued to shape human societies, even as that world disappeared. The early agricultural settlements, the first towns and cities, carried forward social structures and behaviors that had evolved in much smaller, more mobile groups. The emphasis on cooperation, the importance of shared knowledge, the bonds created through common experience, all of these remained central to human societies. But they were now applied to new challenges, to managing crops and herds instead of tracking wild migrations, to building permanent structures instead of temporary camps, to developing technologies for storage and preservation, rather than strategies for following the game. The loss of megafauna also meant the loss of a certain kind of human life. The hunter-gatherer existence, mobile and flexible, deeply connected to the rhythms of the natural world, gradually gave way to sedentary agricultural life. There were gains in this transition, certainly. More reliable food supplies, larger populations, the ability to accumulate material goods, the development of specialized crafts and technologies. But there were losses too. The deep ecological knowledge required to track and hunt megafauna wasn't needed in the same way anymore. The constant movement, the variation of experiences, the tight-knit bonds of small groups that depended utterly on each other, these aspects of life changed as communities grew larger and more settled. Some hunter-gatherer groups persisted, of course, continuing their traditional ways of life in regions where it remained viable. In the Arctic, people followed caribou and hunted marine mammals, using strategies that their ancestors had developed millennia before. In Australia, Aboriginal peoples maintain their connections to the land and its creatures, even as the megafauna they once knew had vanished. In the Amazon, groups hunted tapirs and peccaries, descendants of the larger megafauna that had once roamed south, America. But for most of humanity, the transition to agriculture meant the end of the megafauna hunting way of life. And with that transition came new relationships with animals, relationships based on domestication and control, rather than pursuit and respect for wild creatures. Yet even in agricultural societies, echoes of the megafaunal past remained. Cattle, descendants of the enormous wild aurochs that had shared the landscape with mammoths, became central to many cultures. In some societies, they were valued not just for their practical uses but for their symbolic significance, representing wealth, power, even divinity. Was this partly a carryover from the time when the largest animals commanded respect and awe? The bulls depicted in ancient art, in the caves of Lascaux and on the walls of Minoan palaces, are shown with the same care and attention that was given to mammoths in earlier times. The fascination with size, with power, with the majesty of large animals seems to be a constant in human culture, perhaps rooted in those millions of years when the largest animals were central to human survival. Dragons in mythology, present in cultures across the world, might be another inheritance from this time. These creatures, often described as enormous, powerful, and dangerous, sometimes have features that could be interpreted as dim memories of real animals. The Chinese dragon with its elephant-like features, European dragons hoarding treasures in caves, much as early humans must have found valuable resources in caves inhabited by cave bears. Middle Eastern depictions of dragons that resemble enormous serpents or lizards, perhaps echoing the giant monitor lizards that once prowled those regions. These connections are speculative, impossible to prove, but they raise intriguing questions about how deeply the megafaunal experience is embedded in human culture and psychology. Stories were, after all, how knowledge was preserved in pre-literate societies. Is it so? Impossible that some very old stories might contain kernels of truth about the world that existed before writing, before agriculture, when humans walked among giants. The modern scientific study of megafauna extinction has also revealed something important about human impact on the environment. We often think of environmental destruction as a modern phenomenon associated with industrialization and technology. But the megafauna extinctions show that humans have been reshaping the biosphere for far longer than that. Even with relatively simple technology, relatively small populations, humans were capable of driving large-scale changes in ecosystems, potentially contributing to the extinction of dozens of species. This isn't to place blame on our ancestors. They were doing what they needed to do to survive, in a world where survival was never guaranteed. But it does show that human impact on the environment isn't new. It's been part of our relationship with the natural world for at least as long as we've been recognisably human, perhaps longer. The question this raises is what responsibility we have to the remaining megafauna. Elephants, rhinoceroses, hippos, giraffes, these are the last of the giants, survivors of a much richer megafaunal age. Bison, reduced from tens of millions to near extinction, and now slowly recovering. Whales, the largest animals to ever live, hunted nearly to extinction in the modern era. All of these species face pressures from human activity, habitat loss, poaching, climate change. Do we have an obligation to preserve them? Many would argue that we do, that having already presided over the loss of so many megafaunal species, we shouldn't allow the last survivors to disappear as well. The ecological arguments for preservation are strong. Megafauna play important roles in maintaining healthy ecosystems, roles that smaller animals cannot fill. Elephants shape landscapes, creating waterholes, spreading seeds, modifying vegetation in ways that benefit hundreds of other species. Whales, through their migrations and their enormous bodies, transport nutrients across oceans, fertilizing waters that would otherwise be barren. Bison, when allowed to roam freely, create diverse grassland habitats that support rich communities of plants and animals. When we lose these species, we don't just lose the animals themselves, we lose the ecological functions they perform, the ways they shape and maintain the environments they inhabit. But there's also an aesthetic and spiritual argument for preservation. The world is diminished when we lose its largest, most impressive creatures. There's something profoundly moving about encountering a truly large wild animal, whether it's an elephant in Africa, a bison on the American plains, or a whale breaching in the ocean. These encounters remind us that we're not the only significant species on this planet, that we share the Earth with creatures that command respect, that inspire awe, that connect us to a deeper, older world. And there's a historical argument too. Having lost so much, having presided over the disappearance of mammoths and ground sloths and saber-toothed cats, perhaps we owe it to our ancestors, to the people who lived among the giants and survived to pass their genes on to us, to preserve what remains, to not let the world become further diminished, further emptied of the wild creatures that make it rich and strange. The psychology of living among megafauna shaped human cognition in ways that persist even now. The ability to track animals, to predict their movements, to understand their behaviour, required sophisticated mental modelling. You had to be able to think like a mammoth, to anticipate where the herd would move based on season, weather, available forage. You had to be able to read subtle signs in the landscape, broken branches, disturbed soil, faint tracks, and construct from these clues a narrative about what animals had passed through when and where they might be going. This kind of thinking, inferring the unseen from indirect evidence, constructing mental models of other minds, may have been one of the cognitive foundations that later allowed humans to develop complex language, symbolic thought, and eventually abstract reasoning. The challenges of predicting animal behaviour in a world of giants may have pushed human brains to develop capabilities that we now use for entirely different purposes. Problem solving, planning, hypothesis testing. All of these cognitive skills that we value in modern humans may have their roots in the practical challenges of surviving in a world where reading the landscape and understanding animal behaviour meant the difference between eating and starving. The social intelligence required to coordinate mammoth hunts, to maintain bonds with people you depended on utterly, to share information across generations, also shaped human psychology in fundamental ways. We are social animals in large part because our ancestors needed to be social to survive. The humans who couldn't work well in groups, who couldn't communicate effectively, who couldn't form strong bonds with others, were less likely to survive and reproduce. Over thousands of generations, natural selection favoured traits that made humans more cooperative, more empathetic, better at reading social cues and understanding others' intentions. These traits, evolved in small hunter-gatherer bands facing the challenges of the megafaunal world, are still central to human nature. We still form strong bonds with small groups of people. We still value cooperation and reciprocity. We still have powerful emotional responses to fairness and betrayal. All of these traits, which can seem puzzling in the context of modern societies of millions of people, make perfect sense when you remember that they evolved in groups of a few dozen individuals where everyone knew everyone and survival depended on maintaining social cohesion. The aesthetic sensibility that led our ancestors to paint mammoths on cave walls may also have deeper roots than we realise. The ability to create and appreciate representational art, to take pleasure in images that capture the essence of real things, may be connected to the practical need to observe and remember animals accurately. An artist painting a mammoth wasn't just creating decoration. They were demonstrating knowledge, showing that they understood mammoth anatomy, mammoth posture, the way mammoths moved and interacted. This knowledge had survival value. A person who could accurately observe and remember animal details was more likely to be a successful hunter, more likely to recognize important behaviors, more likely to contribute valuable information to the group. The connection between aesthetic appreciation and practical knowledge may have been seamless in the megafaunal world. Beauty and utility weren't separate categories. An accurate, well-executed image of a bison wasn't just beautiful, it was useful. It demonstrated and transmitted important knowledge. This connection between art and practical knowledge is something we've largely lost in the modern world, where art is often seen as separate from everyday life, as something optional rather than essential. But for our ancestors, the ability to observe closely, to represent accurately, to share visual information, may have been as important to survival as the ability to make tools or start fires. The reverence for large animals that appears in so many ancient cultures, the tendency to associate them with divine power or spiritual significance, may also reflect the reality of living among megafauna. When the largest, most powerful beings in your world are animals, when they can destroy you without effort but also provide for you abundantly if hunted successfully, it's natural to see them as occupying a special place in the order of things. The bull cults of the ancient Mediterranean, the elephant-headed gods of India, the buffalo ceremonies of the plains tribes, all of these may be distant echoes of a time when the relationship between humans and large animals was central to existence, when respecting and honouring these animals wasn't just tradition, but necessity. Even the human relationship with domesticated cattle may carry forward something of this ancient dynamic. Cattle are, after all, descendants of aurochs, enormous wild bovines that stood 2 meters tall at the shoulder and could be as dangerous as any megafaunal animal. The process of domesticating these powerful creatures, of bringing them under human control while still maintaining respect for their size and power, required a particular kind of relationship, a mix of dominance and partnership that humans had been developing through their interactions with wild megafauna for thousands of years. The transition from a world full of megafauna to one dominated by humans wasn't just an ecological shift, it was a psychological and spiritual transformation. Humans went from being small, vulnerable creatures in a landscape of giants to being the dominant large animals in most ecosystems. This must have changed how humans saw themselves, how they understood their place in the world. For millions of years, human ancestors had been prey as often as predators, had lived with the knowledge that they were not the most powerful beings in their environment. The disappearance of the megafauna changed that calculation. Suddenly, humans were the largest, most dangerous creatures in many landscapes. There was nothing that could hunt us with impunity, nothing that we needed to defer to. This shift may have contributed to the development of agriculture and civilization. When you're no longer constrained by the movements of great herds, when you don't have to share the landscape with predators that could kill you, you're free to settle in one place, to modify your environment more aggressively, to accumulate resources without the constant threat of losing them to something larger and more powerful. But this shift also meant the loss of a certain kind of humility, a recognition that humans are part of nature rather than separate from it, that we depend on and are constrained by the other creatures we share the world with. In a world of megafauna, that fact was inescapable. You couldn't pretend to be independent of nature when a mammoth could trample you, when a saber-toothed cat could hunt you, when your survival depended on understanding and respecting the other creatures around you. The loss of megafauna removed some of those constraints, allowed humans to develop a different relationship with the natural world, one based more on control and less on coexistence. Whether this shift was beneficial or harmful is still a matter of debate. It certainly allowed human populations to grow, human cultures to develop complexity, human technology to advance. But it also may have set us on a path that's led to many of the environmental problems we face today, problems that stem from seeing ourselves as separate from nature rather than part of it, from trying to control ecosystems rather than understanding our place within them. Some researchers have suggested that the megafaunal extinctions may have even influenced the development of agriculture in unexpected ways. In regions where megafauna survived longer, the transition to agriculture was often delayed. In Africa and parts of Asia, where elephants and rhinoceroses and other large herbivores persisted, hunting and gathering remained viable longer, providing sufficient resources that the labour-intensive work of cultivation wasn't necessary. Only when human populations grew large enough that wild resources became insufficient did these regions transition fully to agricultural economies. In contrast, in regions where megafauna disappeared more rapidly, the transition to agriculture happened sooner. When you can no longer rely on mammoth hunts to provide concentrated calories, when the largest prey animals available are deer or pigs, the incentive to develop alternative food sources increases. Agriculture, for all its labour intensity, provides more calories per unit of land than hunting and gathering, at least once you lose access to large prey. The extinction of megafauna may thus have been one of the pressures that pushed humans toward agricultural development, forcing innovations that would reshape human societies even more profoundly than the megafauna had. This suggests a kind of historical irony. The very success of humans in hunting megafauna our ability to bring down the largest prey animals, may have contributed to their extinction, which in turn forced us to develop agriculture, which enabled population growth and technological development, which ultimately led to humans becoming the dominant force reshaping the planet. Each change led to the next, not through any deliberate plan, but through the accumulated effects of countless individual decisions made by people trying to survive and provide for their families. The people who hunted the last mammoths had no idea they were hunting the last mammoths. They were just trying to feed their children. The people who first cultivated wild grasses didn't know they were beginning agriculture. They were just trying to make food more reliable, and yet these individual acts, multiplied across thousands of years and millions of people, reshaped the world. Looking back now from our vantage point in the 21st century, we can see the connections, can trace the path from the megafaunal world to the agricultural revolution to industrial civilization. But to the people living through those transitions, it must have seemed like they were simply doing what needed to be done, adapting to changing circumstances, trying to survive in a world that was becoming increasingly different from the one their ancestors had known. The question of what we can learn from the megafaunal extinctions remains relevant today. We're living through another period of rapid environmental change, another time when species are disappearing at rates far above the background extinction rate. The causes are different, the species involved are different, but the underlying pattern is similar. Human activity, whether hunting, habitat modification, or climate change driven by our emissions, is reshaping the biosphere in ways that many species cannot adapt to fast enough. The megafauna extinctions show us that this pattern isn't new, that humans have been reshaping ecosystems for far longer than the industrial era. But they also show us that such changes have consequences, that losing species means losing the ecological functions they performed, that the world becomes diminished in ways that aren't always immediately apparent but that compound over time. The question is whether we can learn from this history, whether we can make different choices, whether we can find ways to coexist with the remaining wildlife rather than continuing down a path that leads to further impoverishment of the biosphere. The challenges are immense. The human population is far larger now than it was during the Pleistocene. We need far more resources. Our technology gives us far more power to reshape environments. The pressures on wildlife are greater than ever, and yet, we also know more than our ancestors did. We understand ecology, understand the interconnections between species, understand the consequences of extinction in ways that early humans could not have. We have the capability, if we choose to use it, to preserve species and ecosystems, to manage our impact, to create space for wildlife even as human populations grow. Whether we will make those choices remains to be seen, but the story of humans and megafauna suggests that it's possible, that humans can coexist with large, powerful animals, can survive and even thrive while sharing the landscape with creatures that dwarf us in size and strength. Our ancestors did it for tens of thousands of years, developing the knowledge and skills and social structures that allowed them to live in a world ruled by giants. Perhaps we can rediscover some of that knowledge, can relearn how to see ourselves as part of the community of life rather than separate from it, can find ways to preserve the few remaining giants so that future generations will have the chance to know them, to be awed by them, to feel that connection to a wilder, older world that humans lived in for most of our history. Some scientists have even proposed bringing back extinct megafauna through de-extinction technologies, using preserved DNA to resurrect species like the woolly mammoth or the aurochs. These proposals are controversial, raising questions about whether we should, whether we can, whether the ecosystems that supported these animals still exist in any meaningful form, but they also reflect a deep human longing for the world of megafauna, a desire to restore something of what was lost, to see the giants walk the earth again. Whether or not such projects succeed, they show that the megafauna still occupy a place in human imagination and aspiration. We haven't forgotten them. We still wonder what it would have been like to see a mammoth, to hear its call, to watch it move across the landscape. That wonder, that curiosity, that sense that something important has been lost, all of these are inheritances from our ancestors who knew these animals firsthand, who built their lives around them, who survived in a world where humans were not yet the dominant species. The story of humans and megafauna is ultimately a story about change, about adaptation, about the complex and often unpredictable consequences of different species interacting. It's a story that reminds us that the world we know is not permanent, that it has been radically different in the past and will be radically different in the future. It's a story that shows both human vulnerability and human resilience, our capacity to survive in the face of enormous challenges, and our capacity to cause enormous changes intentionally or not. It's a story that connects us to the deepest roots of our humanity, to the time when our ancestors learned the skills and developed the traits that would eventually allow our species to spread across the globe and reshape it. And it's a story that isn't over. The few remaining megafauna still walk the earth, still shape ecosystems, still inspire wonder. Their fate, whether they survive or join their extinct relatives, depends largely on choices we make now, on whether we prioritize their preservation, whether we're willing to share the planet with creatures that need vast spaces and abundant resources, whether we can learn to coexist with large wild animals in an increasingly crowded world. In that sense, we're still living in the world of megafauna, still navigating the same fundamental question our ancestors faced. How do humans live alongside creatures so much larger and more powerful than ourselves? The answer our ancestors found was respect, knowledge, adaptation, and the willingness to recognize that they were part of a larger community of life. Perhaps that's an answer we need to rediscover. As you settle in tonight, as your breathing slows and the day's concerns begin to fade, let your mind drift back to that ancient world. Picture the grasslands stretching to the horizon, the herds moving in the distance, the smoke rising from a small fire where a few humans gather against the cold and the dark. Listen for the sounds that have fallen silent, the deep calls of mammoths, the rush of enormous wings, the rustle of a saber-toothed cat moving through tall grass. Feel the weight of that world, the danger and the beauty of it, the constant awareness required to survive, the deep connection to the landscape and its creatures. That world is gone now, faded into time and memory and bone. But it's not forgotten. It lives in the stories we tell, in the landscapes that still bear its marks, in the few giants that remain, and in the part of us that remembers, however dimly, what it was like when humans walked in the shadow of creatures far larger than ourselves. The mammoths are gone, the saber-toothed cats have vanished, the giant ground sloths sleep beneath the earth. But their echoes remain, if you know how to listen. In the quiet of night, in the spaces between thoughts, in the ancient parts of our minds that still carry the experiences of our ancestors, they're there, those giants, still moving through the landscape of memory, still shaping us in ways we're only beginning to understand. And perhaps, in the end, that's enough. Not to have brought them back, not to have prevented their loss, but to remember them, to honour what they were and what they meant, to carry forward the lessons they taught us, and to protect what remains of their legacy. The world was once full of giants. They're gone now, but we're still here, carrying their story forward, trying to understand our place in a world that has changed so much, that continues to change, that will change in ways we cannot predict. But we can learn from what has come before. We can remember. We can choose. And in those choices, perhaps, we honour the memory of the giants, and the small bands of humans who learned to live among them, who survived when survival was never certain, who passed down their knowledge and their genes until they reached us, sitting here thousands of years later, listening to their story in the quiet of the night. Sleep well, knowing that you carry that story with you, that you're connected to a past deeper and stranger than you perhaps realised, that the world has been many things and will be many things more, and that somewhere in the landscape of memory, the giants still walk, still shake the ground, still fill the world with wonder, there, waiting there, in the place where memory and imagination meet, in the stories we tell and the dreams we dream, and they will wait there as long as there are humans to remember them, to wonder about them, to carry forward the legacy of the time when we walked in their shadow and learned what it meant to be small in a world ruled by giants.